Howdy, everybody, and welcome to the first ever installment of the Lighter Side podcast. My name is Jared Leiter.
And I'm Josh Leiter.
You think the last names might be a bit redundant?
Well, nobody knows who we are.
That is a really good point. So this first episode is going to be all about black and white thinking and nuanced points, the dangers of black and white thinking, and why it is so important to be able to have a nuanced conversation.
Let's do it.
Hello again, everybody. I hope you enjoyed your 7 seconds away because, boy, you're going to get a lot of us today. So if you don't know who we are brothers who run a small YouTube channel on YouTube, in case, I didn't make that clear. And I think what we have to do for our listeners who might not be aware of our work is establish how we got started, why we made the exact first video that we made, and what we hope to accomplish with it and what we've hoped to accomplish since. So you actually reached out to me to do the first ever video. So why did you do that? Could you explain to the listener a little about what that video was and how we both felt so strongly about it in the same way so quickly?
Yeah, I mean, essentially we have had these, in-depth, more nuanced conversations about what's going on in the world for a long time. And one particular event happened earlier this year where President Trump was giving a speech or one of his briefings about coronavirus, and decided to kind of off the cuff mention some possible treatments that he had heard of, but didn't know a whole lot about. This included using disinfectants and UV light were the two big ones to kill the virus. Now, this had some medical backing. He didn't just pull it out of nowhere, but was not really super accurate either, and to the usefulness of these things.
Right, and he also, by no stretch of the imagination at that moment, was trying to say, we have these tools right now, and we are about to put them out tomorrow. He was simply brainstorming, like Josh said, off the cuff about possible solutions. And what was so funny is I had the exact same feeling on my side, like, hold on, people are really overreacting, because if you don't remember, social media exploded claiming that Donald Trump was telling, kids and families to, sanitize themselves with Lysol and bleach and all sorts of stuff. And yeah, the jokes might be funny, but there was a true sense that what he said was getting blown out of proportion, and we both had the feeling basically instantly that something was wrong.
Right, and I mean, what we tried to do and how we felt about it didn't even really have to do with what he said or how he said it, really more the reaction. And we constantly criticized the divisiveness, as many people do. We are not breaking ground with this subject, but we got very frustrated with the immediate reaction by both the left and right, where the right felt they had to justify these comments to the nth degree.
Right, so let's explain what should have happened, right? Or what we think should have happened. I think many of you will agree, is Republicans should have been like, well, that's a throwaway. He's just talking. He doesn't have any science to back up those ideas, but their lights do kill some viruses, and there could be some sort of ingestible substance that could kill some viruses and not literally kill you, like bleach would or something like that. And the Democrats should have just been like, oh my gosh, there he goes spitballing again without much information. It should have literally been a non-story, and yet it blew up. And not just on social media. I think it's important sometimes to separate what people get upset about and talk about on their own social media pages, but then also how that gets to Fox News and CNN and MSNBC, and how these stories truly become worldwide and newsworthy, I guess is the term we always use.
Right, absolutely. And I think that level of frustration is what pushed us to record that first video.
Right. So then after we recorded that first video, we started in a long form script fashion, writing these really detailed, and I don't want to make it sound like we weren't doing anything good, and I also want to make it sound like they were incredible. We were trying our best to write these about 5 to 10 minute scripts, and we would shoot these videos where basically we were explaining how a topic could have maybe a middle ground approach, or maybe just that people were thinking about those things wrongly. I mean, the YouTube channel still exists. It's a lighter side. You can check it out. But what we decided to do is maybe look more into the podcast market. It's a new market. There aren't that many podcasts out there.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're really cornering this brand new media, and I feel excited about it.
Yeah, cutting edge. And I think before we started recording, you said you really felt like Steve Jobs, right?
Right, in his garage, developing the first Mac. It really feels that way.
Just raw. So But why do we think the podcast is maybe a better space for this?
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard to do nuance in a 10-minute script. Firstly, I mean, you can simplify it, but that's kind of almost counterintuitive. Simplifying nuance is almost fighting your own goals.
Yeah, and on top of that, I think maybe our videos made it sound like we thought we knew everything. And that's the exact opposite of what we wanted to put out there. We wanted to put out there that it is totally acceptable to not have all the information on a topic and to still want to work to some sort of good end. And I think the videos might have given the false impression that we were really, really experts on a lot of stuff and we thought we had the right to talk about it. And that was definitely not what we were trying to do at all.
Right, and I think we definitely don't want to come off as people telling you the right answers. We want to come off as normal people having the type of discussion that we think would really benefit this country right now.
Yes, so that kind of leads us to, I feel like we're going to talk about ourselves just for one more second and then we'll be through it. But I think maybe we should give the listener a little bit of an indication of why we might be true middle ground people. I think a lot of people say, "Oh, I'm in the middle on this. I promise you can trust me. I'm unbiased here. I'm unbiased there." Why do you think, and why do we think we might be trustworthy when it comes to being unbiased and being in the middle on most issues?
Right. I mean, without giving you our whole life story, I think
you'd enjoy it. You really would.
Novel worthy, if anything ever has been. Yeah. But we grew up in Ohio in a very rural conservative county in a conservative Christian family, in a relatively open-minded family in general. However, definitely
conservative leaning,
strongly conservative leaning. Then we both went to college in the same liberal city, inside of a liberal county at what one can only call a liberal university.
Right. By same as we went to the same college. It was actually only 30 minutes away from our very conservative county, so it was kind of weird. It's a fairly liberal city smashed right in between a lot of conservative counties.
Right. I mean, welcome to Ohio. And I think that's another thing. We grew up in Ohio, a battleground state. We grew up in a conservative county, but being a battleground state, we have people of all viewpoints, and you hear them a lot from growing up all the way through now.
Yeah, we live on the Ohio-PA border, and two battleground states. I mean, most times if those two states go the same way, the election will almost always go that way. We, growing up in that conservative family, definitely felt like the liberal, people on TV made a lot of sense. Like, I think a lot of times when you're a kid and you hear different perspectives for the first time, you either shut it out or you kind of get really interested in it. And I think both of us were sort of open to, like Jon Stewart when he was making jokes, I think make a lot of sense. Right. Stephen Colbert made a lot of sense to us when he was doing his
we both like funny people, and conservatives are not wrong, but the media tends to lean liberal, so that
yeah, no, they're absolutely not wrong about that at all. And that's something that I think we can more rightly say from where we're positioned. That even if sometimes we do lean left, we understand that the media also leans that direction, and why that could be a little bit problematic there. So what we've decided to do, though, to make this borderline listenable for you guys out there, is we have come with questions for each other a little bit, and we're just going to ask them back and forth, see where the conversation goes. So I think we're going to use a term today, nuance, about 1 million times. We're going to try to keep it to as minimal as possible as to not nauseate you, but we are going to say it a lot. So I think the first thing we have to do is to define it. So Josh, my first question to you is, what is a nuanced point? Can you define it for us?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with in a simple fashion, and I mean, that's the gray area, right? I mean,
I would like, and I think the listener would too, the most black and white definition you could give us of nuance would be great.
Too bad, I'm going to give you a very nuanced definition of nuance. I think, you have to start with that idea of the gray area in between two black and white points, or in a lot of the cases of our conversation, we can refer to them as blue and red points. I think is a decent way. However,
and we're the purple people in the middle.
The purple people. And the more complicated definition would definitely be the discussion of ideas that fall in between two greater ideas. And I think that that's something that we both think is missing from politics, from culture, from society, from, dare I say it, the internet. I think all of those things are somewhere where it's always easier to take a point, A or point B, a black and white, red or blue. but the ideas in between there, and more importantly, especially for us, is the discussion of the points in between there. We don't even have an issue with landing on a black and white decision. On a lot of particular issues, we fall red or blue. We don't necessarily, it doesn't mean you always have to have an opinion that falls in between.
Right. The idea of a horse designed by a committee as a camel, is real. The more you get into discussions, if you just always take a middle approach and you always accommodate, you're going to have a mess. That's not what we're talking about. We're simply talking about the idea that someone, even on a hot button issue like abortion, could, share their ideas with someone with different ideas, and they could have a wonderful conversation about that topic, and wonderful being defined as, how well they communicate. And they could both leave having maybe learned something, but not really changing their points. It doesn't matter that someone might hold a firm point to that. It's simply the fact that they were able to have that conversation that matters. And, just to provide a little bit of clear context to this, we are recording this in the summer or the end of summer of 2020. And from the coronavirus to the election to the Black Lives Matter protesters and the riots that happened in some cases across our country, it is so important to be able to have a nuanced conversation, and we have not been able to have one. And I have a little bit of an example to explain what I'm talking about. Not only growing up in this area, but still living in this area myself, I was confronted with a lot of questions from more conservative people whom I work with, great people who really just wanted to have an honest conversation. And a lot of it circulated around the George Floyd murder and subsequent protests. And one point that they continually made to me was, what if, just what if, they wanted me to think hypothetically, what if we could prove that police officer who killed George Floyd did not have racial motivations to his actions? What if we could actually jump inside the mind of that person? Should it change our perspective on it? The other thing that I constantly got asked was, after the second autopsy report came back and there were drugs in George Floyd's system, I was asked, does that change your thought process on this issue? And let me say that both of those conversations, I hope everyone realizes, are incredibly difficult, nuanced conversations. Now, my personal answers to both probably aren't as important, but I will share them with you simply because, I want you to be able to see how a nuanced conversation might work. What I would say to people who ask me about the police officer's motivations is, it has allowed for a broader, more important conversation to take place. So the fact that NBA players or NFL players are standing up and protesting, wouldn't, in my mind, need to stop if we could prove that, a police officer had certain motivations or not. And then with the whole toxicology report, that is important. And I think it does become part of public conversation, and it should be able to be part of public conversation. But we saw, firsthand evidence that the police had, stopped George Floyd, had him on the ground, and that he was still lucid enough to be able to communicate before, his heart gave out or he was unable to breathe and he passed away. So I do think that, those are only points you can make. Those are only conversations you can have if you're willing to listen to people and open to that idea of nuance.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of your point there that I kind of want to hit back on just a tiny little bit is definitely the fact that, sometimes the point is the discussion more so than the event. Floyd's death, regardless of how it actually happened, what the actual motivations were, any of that, still brought up a conversation of a bigger problem. And there's nothing necessarily innately wrong with that, regardless of how this turns out, regardless of the motivations behind it. I mean, it was the same thing with the Kaepernick protests. I think what triggered those, I think it was Trayvon Martin. Was that, I might be wrong about that.
I don't know off the top of my head.
But the point is, obviously Kaepernick was not protesting one individual event, but one individual event set that off in his mind that to protest a bigger systematic problem, or what he saw as a bigger systematic problem. And kind of our point is that those details sometimes aren't here or there, which is a weird thing to say about horrible events. However, you can't boil down a protest, a movement, a conversation to just one specific event.
Right. And one thing we need to get way better at, and one thing I don't think we respect in a maybe conservative person's mind as much is, start to talk on the other side about maybe how difficult it is to be a police officer, or how, in certain situations maybe the media does make the story about X when it's Y. We need to also be able to have that conversation.
Right.
That's all really I would say on that point is, as much as we have both been on literal public record, even though we only have, a handful of subscribers, we've both been on public record being very supportive of a lot of these protests, a lot of the points being made. We just have to be able to have hard conversations on the other side as well. That's the only thing I would say on that as well. So.
Right. Absolutely. I agree. So that being said, let's jump into my first question for you, which is like, what does nuance look like at a governmental level? Let's apply it. And one of the big things that we always jump at is criticizing government, and it's something that I think always needs to be done. Government is here to serve at some level, whether you think it should be in a small or big capacity. But in practicality, what does nuance applied look like?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think those of us who like to spend a lot of time thinking about government, thinking about what government should do, what it shouldn't do, how it should do it, how it shouldn't do it, I think we do spend a lot of time creating ideal governments in our head where, they can actually distinguish between people's intent, people's not intent. They can actually distinguish between, individual circumstances in every case. And obviously that isn't true. So one thing we do have to keep in mind when we're talking about nuance in government is we do have this thing called the judicial branch of our government, and they do have to uphold certain laws, and the laws are written by this thing called the legislative branch of our government, who has to make sure that those laws are written in such a way as to be understood. And that works on a state level and a county level as well. Obviously, a lot of criminal offenses and different things like that actually aren't even handled by the U.S. government. But when you are dealing with that level of specificity, sometimes we do have to be very careful about saying that there can be nuance in government. And I do think there can be. You think there can be as well. But it doesn't look like a law that accounts for someone to be able to do something in one circumstance and not get in trouble, and someone else do the exact same thing and get in trouble. That just obviously can't work. Right. So I think more it has to do, again, back to the same thing of discussion. What would a politician who's more conservative leaning, want for the country? How would they have a conversation with someone who's a little bit more liberal leaning, or people on their same side who are maybe uber conservative? I think that's more where we can find, nuance in government, is the degrees to which people uphold certain values, how they're willing to agree with people across the aisle. And this literally sounds like I'm describing a Barbie paradise, because that's just not how government seems to work now. But, I think we've had good discussions on this on a couple fronts, both with immigration and also with gun possession, how the Second Amendment rights, things like that. The difference between how a nuanced conversation can happen, but how maybe a nuanced law couldn't happen. So maybe piece together my ramblings there a little bit for the audience.
Right. I think one thing that I can definitely pick out there that is very direct is the fact that nuanced conversation is different than, like, when a law is made, a decision has to be made. One individual decision has to be made for a law, for a policy, whatever. You have to make a decision, which makes nuance becomes a very complicated subject, because that one decision can appear always black and white. You can always put that at the end of a spectrum, essentially. And so that's one thing. Yes, it's always difficult with each individual decision, because a final place has to be found.
Right, but on the lead up to that decision, it doesn't have to be the other party is after me. Right. The other party has my best interest. They actually have my worst interest at heart. Right. That's something that we I think have felt more and more with each election, is that Democrats are more after Republicans. Republicans are more after Democrats. We're actually going to talk about that a little bit later at the end. But I think if I understand you right, it's saying that maybe understanding that when a certain political group or a certain party's in charge, a lot of things might go one way, but that the public discussion on it isn't those sneaky Democrats who don't appreciate our way of life, or those old school Republicans don't have our way of life in mind at all.
Right. That brings us up to like the something I definitely wanted to get to at some point here, which is like the team mentality, which is very, it pretty much anti-nuance,
Right.
anti-nuance as something can get, which is the fact that I do think a great, it's not an idea, it's just, should happen, is that the nuance in government definitely, I think, looks like people being open to not just different ideas, because you still have agendas you have to serve, you still have beliefs. It's open to that conversation.
Yeah, and I think, we don't need to go down this rabbit hole because I think we might do this for a different conversation. But it does start to make you think about how, the politicians know. It's not like they don't understand nuance. It's not like they behind closed doors don't understand. Man, if my thoughts were just a little bit different about this, all of my beliefs, would go out the window. So like sometimes you do feel bad for them almost when they get up to the microphone and they have to borderline preach the importance of their ideas and how ridiculous the other side is, when in the back of their mind they're thinking, well, if I actually, thought just a little bit differently about, or if I wanted this end, a little bit differently, I probably would actually totally agree with them.
Right. Yeah. I definitely, and we've talked about that, and so this will probably be saved for a future episode in terms of systemic problems that kind of put, we always think politicians bad. I think everybody across the board is kind of negative politicians, even liberals at this point.
Even politicians.
Right. Politicians don't like them either.
Yeah.
It's pretty much a universally hated thing, but when you start to really dive into the fact that, we say politics is a dirty game in general, and politics has really, the system of politics has really crumbled. So I think this is a whole episode we can expect for a future day, which is just the systemic problems that have led us here.
Yeah, and I just want to I feel like I was being purposely vague there because maybe I was afraid to say a thing or two. Let me give a concrete example of what I mean. Let's say, for instance, that a Republican were to get up to the microphone, like a Mike Pence, a very conservative Christian individual, and share certain views on the sanctity of the country, maybe with immigration, like the whole Manifest Destiny thing, or things like abortion, something that is so tied to his personal beliefs on the world he lives in. He has to play the game of, I'm only talking to the people who agree with me. The other people are evil. When in the back of his mind, he's smart enough to understand, oh, if maybe I wasn't a conservative Christian in this way, I can see where Nancy Pelosi, with a different background, really wants the ends that she wants in terms of, abortion law and also in terms of immigration law. So that's kind of what I'm talking about. I was maybe a little bit afraid to share that for some reason, but I felt like I was being too vague.
Right. You just name dropped two pretty hated names, and so it's pretty easy to get that direction.
Close personal friends of the podcast. Nancy Pelosi and Mike Pence.
Right. We're gonna have them on. We're gonna have one of them on next week. Whichever one you'd rather do, just watch next week, because that one is probably gonna be on.
Oh wow, yeah. That would be. I'm not even. Yeah.
I'm
not gonna touch it with a 10-foot pole. Actually, totally leave that. So, I think what we really want to talk about is we're reaching the 25-minute mark. We're not sure how long we want these to be, but we're a little over the place here. What ultimately would we like to see? Like, what are we trying to accomplish? What is the problem? And then maybe what are some possible solutions we can brainstorm with the rest of our time? What is the problem? You need to define the problem first, I guess, as people say.
Right. So the sociological problem, the high thinking problem, is essentially the lack of nuance. But to kind of define what that means in real world context is simply the division that's going on right now. And the division has led us to one side hating the other side almost across the board. And so that's the problem. We're talking about government. We're not talking about Ohio State versus Michigan. We're not talking about Yankees, Red Sox. We are talking about society. And so we can't have this mentality about society.
And by can't, he means we shouldn't, right? Because it's actually incredibly scary how much we can. I don't even think the two of us would have guessed at 15, 18 years old that this level of dissension and division would actually be possible. That a country could function with this much, just division in general. So do we have any data that might be able to tell us that we have this much division, or are we just two young kids who are mad at the world and want to change everything?
Wow, that was a softball. So based on the notes that we both worked on here, I think we do have some statistics.
Oh, we do have some statistics.
What?
Sweet.
So this has been a statistic that's been kind of parroted by a lot of people doing similar discussions.
Can I say, you use the word parroted better than anyone I know.
Oh,
I love it. You do such a good job with that word.
You know what? I'm really going to try to work some other animals into the vocabulary. Parroted, such a great word. We should have like some giraffing, some rhinoceros.
Oh, I was thinking giraffing too. Maybe when you're speaking above people's heads,
It's
like when you're getting a little bit too philosophical with people, you're giraffing. So what is so I personally want to share with the audience the numbers of that statistic.
Okay.
But could you just give some background? Could you just give some background about?
So, I mean, it's a Pew Research study from, I believe, 2016. And essentially what they did was compare how people felt about the opposite political party back in the 80s, I think it was?
Yeah, the 80s, and like the way it was written was sort of like before a certain time period. So I don't really know how they compiled that data, but so like we'll just call it the 1980s and before for our understanding.
Right. So that's our parents' politics and prior. So that type of politics, when you asked somebody back then if they agreed with the other party's politics, they pretty much across the board would say no, obviously. However, when you ask them, do you feel threatened by the other party's politics? So both Democrats and Republicans were asked this about the opposite party. They essentially both, across the board, we said less than 20%, I think it was. We really should have done the exact statistics, but it was for sure sub 20% said that they were threatened by the other party.
And sub 10% said that they would allow their child to marry somebody from a different...
They would disapprove.
They would disapprove. Yeah. I keep using that word. I'm so sorry. When we talked about this,
right? So over 90% said that they would allow their child.
No. So you just said the same thing. Allow their. No.
But I said over 90%. I flipped the statistic.
Oh, I'm so sorry. So no, okay. So basically, what we're saying is that we'll just let's give an exact percentage and be wrong. Okay, so like 8% of Democrats would say, I don't want you to marry a Republican. Okay, and about the exact same percentage would do it in the reverse. Right. Today actually being a couple of years ago, and I think we can both safely assume it's getting worse. It's not getting better.
Right. I mean, if they published it in 2016, I believe, so it would have been the years leading up to this that they did the research, and you can like you said, you can only imagine it's worse than these 2016 statistics.
Right. So in 2016, that number for the amount of people who felt threatened by the other party was 50%. 50% of people who held conservative ideas or values or considered themselves conservatives thought that found Democrats threatening, right? That's crazy. And I don't know how you can say it loudly enough to convince people it's crazy. It's one of those things you say and everyone just says, okay, duh. No, that's not normal. And I think it was about a third of both parties now disapprove of their child marrying someone of a different political party, not allowing their group, their family to get any bigger without having the same values politically. And you think about these statistics, and this is just something I have to share because I love stats, but think about it. If 50% of Democrats are saying that they feel threatened by the other party, is that number actually higher or actually lower? Well, likely it's probably higher because if you really think about why you were being asked that question, your brain might self-correct and say, oh, I don't want to sound like a jerk. I don't want to sound like somebody who hates Republicans. So really it's 50% or higher of each party feels threatened by the other party, which it's crazy to think about. That defines in a nutshell why we can't view the other person as having a good intention but just wanting a different country than you. Nobody is comfortable with that idea. If you're a Republican, you think the Democrats are after you and vice versa.
Right. Which, and to bring it back to the whole reason we started this, was that is the problem, right? You can't live in a society, well, you can live in a society, but we can't call a society sustainable if you have two people who are two ideas that are so ideologically, opposed to one another. Right. Thank you. Couldn't come with the word opposed. I guess this is a great start. That they literally feel attacked by somebody else's just beliefs, not even necessarily when these manifest into actions, but just the idea of them possibly manifesting into action causes a huge division that we are now seeing in America. And you can blame whatever you want, right? People will blame mainstream news. You will blame the internet, social media.
I blame social media and the internet.
Blame social media.
I really, really, really blame social media and the internet.
And a lot of liberals will blame specifically Trump for this. And there are positive, there are truths and negatives to all of those, mainly social media. Truth to that, but at this point, we can't even be too obsessed with why. Well, the why is almost past the point of being important, to the point where we have to understand that regardless of whose fault it is, this is a serious problem for Americans, period. Blue, red, liberal, conservative, doesn't matter. This is a problem for all of us.
Yeah, and something I've become incredibly passionate about, and it was part of actually what I was reading. Shout out to a brilliant psychologist, kind of a not political, but more social commentator now, Jonathan Haidt, Haidt. Brilliant psychologist, worked at a lot of different universities across the country, but he wrote a book called The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. And I was already reading this before we started doing the show and the YouTube show. And I just have become so passionate about the idea that the liberal ideal for our world is great, and the conservative ideal for our world is also great. We are dealing with two different ideological thoughts about a brilliant world. And it's really kind of alarming, like that we don't understand this. So a liberal idea of the world based on Jonathan Haidt's research and kind of just a little bit of obvious thought, if you really, really start to follow the ideological principles to their end.
Right, some common sense.
Yeah, so like, I don't want to offend anybody, but liberals sort of do have that ideal world in mind, that John Lennon-esque imagine world in the back of their minds of, what kind of world could we have? If we started by solving the biggest problem for the most people in whatever country they lived in, not necessarily your country, and then we worked our way up with social reform and activism to produce the best possible world. And best possible world possible does not sound good, but that's what I mean. And then I think what's harder to understand is the beauty of a conservative world, because I think a lot of people only see kind of darkness down that path. That's a little dramatic, but what really a beautiful conservative world looks like is everyone taking care of their own people, community support, brotherly love in the most, being very specific with what brother means, right? You see people who take care of their own lawn, are willing to help out each other in their small, tight-knit community, and that actually has a lot to do with culture too. Conservative people on the whole tend to care a lot more about culture, which seems sort of backwards because you always hear liberal people talking about cultural exploration. But what's funny about that is a liberal person is more likely to want to go to all the cultures of the world and soak up a little bit of each little bit, but they don't really tend to, and again, this is a huge generalization, but they don't tend to want to take the time to, in their own neck of the woods, repeat the same culture over and over again. So that's just my point in trying to make anyone understand that someone on the other side from you might have such a more beautiful ideal for the world than you realize. And we lose that a lot. And a lot of people, let's be honest, don't have an ideal for the world at all. And sometimes we're at fault for not thinking about that.
Right. I mean, there's certainly nothing wrong with necessarily not having an overarching view of the world. There's definitely something to be said on that. I don't have a solid line stance right this second about the world, because the world is a complex place. And to not fall into necessarily one of those groups is not a bad thing and can be a good thing. But I think, kind of to hit on what you were saying, definitely part of this nuanced discussion has to be understanding the other side, right? And so that's definitely one of the things we tried to speak to on our channel, and as we're trying to speak to now, is the fact that at the very least, even if you are unbudgeable on your liberal stances or your conservative stances, you need to understand the fact that the other side has reason to feel the way they do. Not just on a personal level, but on a logical, on a sociological level, those beliefs make sense. Not every one of them might make sense to you, but the overall purpose makes sense. And our second video ever, horrible production quality, not like this is
lit, fam. This is the best production.
Right.
Production that rivals, I don't know, revisionist history or something.
Right.
But
exactly. But our second video ever, Jared really did a great job breaking down the same Republican versus Democrat overarching beliefs and why maybe not necessarily everything that the current party members represent.
Yeah, right. But why like a person who is an old school conservative or an old school liberal, why they believe wholeheartedly and fundamentally in things in general, just like why they hold true to their beliefs and think that they're important.
The true beliefs behind both Democrats and Republicans are really good points, and they're really necessary to society.
Yeah, they're sort of innate, and I'll go down one more rabbit hole. Is if you follow both to their logical conclusion, it creates problems too. Like, I don't know if anyone's a big fan of South Park out there, but there was an episode, and they're so brilliant, and they people think they always just bash conservatives, but they don't. They're really, really consistent. And they did this joke where if a liberal ideology went to its logical end, everyone would wear gray suits, and everyone would be a like very beige color. Like the whole world would just become flat. It would become static. And again, you don't think that's the case with liberal ideas because you think there's this personal expression, but really what happens is an openness to where everybody is fluid on everything consistently, and everyone sort of becomes the same mash. But then on the other side,
if you take no hardline stances for, if you're just accepting of everything always with no true deep down rooted opinions that are illogical, that are personal, the fact that, it's not exactly a beautiful picture of society.
Right. And then on the opposite end, a true conservative value to its end does tend, I have to be so careful here, but it does tend to get you to your more man, I'm trying to avoid the word racist. I really am. But it takes you to this group mentality that is so pervasive and so strong that you're actually willing to go back to a point where we would war with each other. Like my community is so good now, I want to test it. I want to test it against your community. I want my community to
the us versus the other mentality, and again, not other in a culture or even race sense, just people who are not part of my in-group.
Right. So again, both parties have a beautiful end, and both parties also have a sort of dangerous end to them as well, which actually gets at the question of maybe, did the parties come more from human nature than the other way? Did we end up stumbling upon these two parties more for an internal human nature perspective than anything else, which we did not come up with that question either. That's been talked about before.
No, and I mean, that's definitely the beauty of kind of discussing the two parties, is the fact that you definitely see the two sides of human nature, the community caring almost to trying to make life fair almost to an excessive point with liberalism, and the survivalist, me and my group versus everybody else mentality that comes with conservatism.
Yeah.
I mean, you definitely both see it. But enough rambling on that. We could make a whole other episode about that. In fact, if you are interested in the future episodes, this one is definitely more of a general sense of how we think and how we want to think and how we want you to think. But in the future, we've got definitely some episodes planned that are a little bit more practical, really applying this to something else. We've got one on kind of exploring political parties. There are a lot of really good reasons why we have two main political parties, but it's also kind of borderline destroying the country. So we really can delve into the both practical and more thought-provoking things of having two political parties. And then on top of that, we've also got one coming about kind of more structural problems in the U.S. government, which is a fun thing to do, pontificating on the problems of our world.
Yeah, speaking of pontification, we occasionally, get some criticism from family members, friends, coworkers, students, patients. I'm a teacher and he's a nurse, and sometimes we get a little bit of criticism for being a little too heady sometimes, like being a little bit too psychological and philosophical in our discussions. And one thing I just want to end with is a really, really practical tool. I just hit my cup in case anyone cares. Just a really practical tool to use, and that's asking questions. So if you're in a conversation with someone, instead of trying to make your point, just practice asking questions to them, because it works on two levels. Let's say you are dealing with someone who is being a little bit belligerent or being very difficult to talk to, and you do want to actually prove them wrong. Questions are going to be the best way to do that. Right. And let's say you, on the other side, which is what we hope, you're having a great conversation with someone you do want to learn from, but also want to be able to teach a little bit. The best way to do that is, again, with questions. I mean, just across the board, the wisest people we know ask questions and don't, talk.
Absolutely. I mean, you accomplish something either way. If you ask, an ignorant person a question who is not being pleasant, who is not truly engaged in the conversation in a good way, you are kind of going to expose them. You're going to let them expose themselves for the problems they're having in the conversation. And if you are talking to somebody who's talking appropriately and knows what they're talking about, you're going to learn something. So either way, ask questions, don't tell people.
Right. Like instead of doing a podcast, we should just ask questions to people.
How about if we just carried this mic around to the streets and just started asking random people questions? That wouldn't be annoying at all.
No, that'd be great. Okay, so that 40 minutes is a good number. Let's stick to that.
Bang.
So we are so happy if anyone tuned into this. We are trying to build up a community on Nuanced Conversations. Hit us up on our Facebook page, The Lighter Side. Watch our YouTube channel. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. And just be open. If we've said something wrong, if you've said something we disagree with, all we want is for you to tell us specifically what you disagree with about it, and hopefully we can have another good conversation about that. Here at The Lighter Side, we have no interest in changing what you think, just how we all think. Have a great day, everybody.